year from our PIUs, and I want to welcome you all to the launch of the 6th edition of the Liberia Economic Update. The theme of today's launch, from stabilization to inclusion, pathways to resilient growth and productive jobs, is happening at this time. So, can we call on our country manager, Madam Georgia Wallen, to provide some opening remarks?
Good morning to all. Honorable ministers and officials of the Liberian government, development partners, excellencies, representatives of the private sector and civil society, members of the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for today's launch of the 6th edition of the Liberia Economic Update. Twice a year, the LEU provides an opportunity to take stock of Liberia's economic performance while also delving into a topical issue that matters for Liberia's development. This edition focuses on a topic that is on everyone's mind: jobs. The report's theme is From Stabilization to Inclusion, Pathways for Resilient Growth and Productive Jobs. As you'll hear in the presentation in a few minutes, the report highlights some good and positive news, particularly the marked improvement in Liberia's macroeconomic situation, with improved fiscal and external sector outcomes. And we want to acknowledge and celebrate all progress that Liberia is making. At the same time, the report provides valuable and challenging insights about Liberia's private sector and labor markets, examining employment patterns, job quality, demographic shifts, and constraints to productive jobs and resilient growth. Ultimately, our goal in producing the Liberia Economic Update is to translate knowledge into action. The key question is, how can Liberia address the jobs challenge head-on, building on the country's current reform momentum? The report points to 4 strategies for delivering more and better jobs in Liberia. First, stimulating labor demand through agro-processing and light manufacturing. Second, enabling firm growth through financial and regulatory reform. Third, modernizing the business environment and strengthening public-private coordination. And finally, expanding labor participation through skills with focus on youth and gender-focused interventions that also engage Liberia's women. These measures can change the game and help position Liberia for more productive, job-rich growth and improved resilience to future shocks. A multi-stakeholder, collective approach will also be key for achieving these objectives. Over the next 5 years, World Bank Group partnership with Liberia will focus intensively on building foundations for more and better jobs. And we look forward to launching the new CPF, Country Partnership Framework, next month. We hope the Liberia Economic Update can help to inform our collective efforts to tackle Liberia's job challenge and unlock opportunities for future generations and future progress. It will take all of us working together. And so we're so grateful that you have taken your time to join us today here in the room and also online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia. We'll now call on Honorable Sewell to provide some remarks on behalf of the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning. Honorable Sewell.
Deputy Minister Woman Reeves, Director of NAFA, all senior officials of government, Georgia Walling and Country Manager, our ambassadors, excellencies, our colleagues from the civil society, the private sector, members of the media. I want to say thanks to the World Bank, which is our major partner and major contributor to our development program in Liberia. To be specific, World Bank is also co-chairing the economic transformation pillar of the AARD, and I'm so pleased that at this moment we are looking at an instrument that actually represents the performance of our economy, looking at the view from the World Bank. On behalf of the Minister of Finance, Honorable Gossip Gafon, we want to extend our thanks and appreciation to the team at the World Bank, the technical team that produced this report, which is very much informative and more data-driven. It's also looking at us more like in the clinical section as the manager of the economy. We want to appreciate you, particularly Wahi and Gwe. I know whenever we talk about the technical numbers in Liberia, we sing about the World Bank and the IMF. I know our other partners are there, but what comes from these two institutions also represents the rest of the world. Looking at the snapshot of your report, we want to say that as a country and a manager of the economy, with the keynotes, looking at some successes and challenges as we're looking at it. But one thing we want to declare that which will be coming out during our panel discussion is that we are doing everything within our effort as a country to sustain the growth. We are also pleased to look at the title of the report, which is very much key, from stabilization to inclusion, articulating the vision from the president to say a rest agenda for inclusive development. To make our growth more inclusive, it means that all of the sector have to be involved. And with citizen participation, that is very much key. As I look at the report, I'm glad that our growth number remains strong. At the same time, it's important to know that one of the major challenges that the country faces have been the issue of economic governance and political governance, which your report have outlined clearly that there's a rich job growth opportunity for us as a country, which we will take it into consideration as we plan for our fiscal year 2026. I'm also glad to know that our poverty rate is kind of moderating, meaning that much needs to be done. On the south side of this report, I want to say on behalf of the Minister of Finance and Development Planning to urge and encourage our Liberian private sector be specific, but to encourage you to say we need you as partner. One good thing now with support from the World Bank, we want to see how best the private sector can get involved with what we call now, we have a policy on public-private partnership as a way, as a driver for job creation, which will need you more than any time in the history of this country. The PPP approach does not only create jobs, it stabilizes the economy. It creates opportunity that the younger generation, particularly youth of this country, will have the opportunity to think, to innovate, to bring development to our country. Most importantly, I know Georgia mentioned this in terms of fiscal consolidation. We are glad that the revenue performance has been strong, and we think that revenue performance will be stronger were we to embark more on private sector investment to bring more inclusive development activities. As we speak, we are working on the National Development Plan, National Budget for fiscal 2026. And I'm so much pleased to say that President Barker will be in a position to hit $1 billion revenue target. Which of course is all about the work with our partners, including the World Bank. And we want to say thanks to even our colleague at the Liberia Revenue Authority, the private sector, to let the public know that sometimes quietude brings result. It's not a louder noise. Before I take my seat, I want to recognize the role played by the IFC in strengthening our private sector as well. Our European partners, our diplomatic community, we all need to work together. The multilateral partners, the bilateral partners are needed. In all that we do, we need you. To the civil society, many of you also think that it's about advocacy. Sometimes the advocacy has to be translated into activity and meeting the national target. Long years ago, we were all there saying we need this change. But once you are a player, you have to make the change as a player and no longer to be a spectator in your own economy. We want to encourage you, work closely, targeted approach with the private sector, the Liberia Chamber of Commerce, the Liberia Business Association, and particularly sectors that are growth driver. The advocacy should be something that brings about change in our development landscape. So thank you so much for your support. And at this time, I declare this ceremony open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable So. We'll take this time to call on Wade Gate Tower, who is our country economist and one of the authors to this very important report, to make a presentation. Wade?
We're waiting the technical team to put up the presentation. see the smaller screens are working, but the bigger ones seem to be off. So at this point, you have copies of the report before you. It's a good time to be going through it until we can get it up and running to have much more discussion. So I see one of the screens is up, so we'll use that to go on with our presentation. So like the country manager mentioned, the Liberia Economic Update presents recent economic development and focuses on topical issues that matter to the country. And this edition is the 6th edition, and it's focused on the issue of growth and jobs. So we've had 6 editions of this update. We started sometime in 2020 when we looked at the impact of COVID on the economy. And then next we talk about fiscal space for government. And the 3rd edition was looking at investment in human capital. The 4th edition looked at getting rights right for productivity and poverty alleviation. And the 5th was focused on the energy sector, where we talk about powering growth. And this edition is looking at growth and jobs. So for recent economic development, a summary of the performances in recent years shows that Liberia has been able to sustain growth in the economy since 2021 from the rebound from COVID. And last year was no exception, even though growth moderated last year, but the economy grew, and the growth in 2024 was broad-based. So I think with some of the screen up, we can start from there. Okay, so you can either use the 2 extreme screens. So another very important thing that happened, this is an economy that saw a massive increase in inflation at some point in time. Last year, inflation eased, even though some structure exists. So we saw that core inflation driven by other factors, swell towards the end of the 2024 year. The fiscal situation in the country improved thanks to the government for embarking on efforts to boost domestic resource mobilization and to enhance their spending efficiency. And with that, we saw a downward trend in debt levels. And the country external position strengthening, driven by trade dynamics. While it's true that export improved, but just at a moderate rate, but we also saw a decline in import, and that situation yielded a stronger external position. And with stable growth and inflation easing, extreme poverty declined, regardless of which metrics you used. We'll talk more about that. However, the country's job challenges remain. So this is the picture of growth since 2020. From the rebound, we've been able to sustain growth, and over the medium term, we have a positive outlook, even though it's subject to several downside risks. So growth in last year was broad-based. We saw a moderation in the industrial sector growth. However, that was compensated for from services, from improvements in services and agriculture. In terms of price development, inflation moderated, even though non-food inflation remained high during the year. And all thanks to the monetary authorities, they maintained a tight policy stance, and appropriately so, this has culminated into easing inflation. And as of September, year-on-year inflation was somewhere around 4.7%. So as you can see, the picture on the right shows you the monetary authority stance. As you can see, the monetary policy rate has been kept well above inflation. And that tight stance is yielding some results. We see inflation coming down. So on the fiscal side, the performance markedly improved. There were targeted fiscal measures implemented by the government during that point in time, and the goal was to make sure that the government primary deficit was smaller. So there was some increase in domestic revenue mobilization, but the bigger thing the government was able to do was to be able to enhance the spending efficiency. So there were adjustments. Thank you. So there were adjustments on the spending side, but this was done without compromising the goal of keeping capital spending, at a level to be able to unlock the potential of the economy. So the adjustment mostly happened on the consumption spending side. Capital spending was maintained, and that outcome yielded to a smaller primary deficit, and this helped to improve the public debt level. When I say improve, I'm talking about some modest reduction. We saw some modest reduction in public debt. So we'll talk about the targeted measures. Most of them were intended to boost domestic revenue mobilization, but at the same time, to be able to enhance spending efficiency right after the elections. So those adjustments happening both on the revenue side, on the spending side. As you can see, this is the revenue side. We saw a little uptick in in total revenue and grants mobilization. There was much more of grants in 2024, even though grants are drying up, which means that the government has to exert much more of efforts to be able to boost domestic resource mobilization in the coming years to compensate for the reduction in grants. On the external side, we see that the trade balance improved, and rightly so, as a result of more gold exports. We have much more of gold export. Export was driven by gold, but on the other side, there was reduction in fuel and capital goods, which was not really a favorable signal because it pointed to a lower level of investment. However, it yielded a stronger position for us. So this is a picture of exports. As you can see, gold export was the main driver of export. Gold was the main driver of export during the year. And on this side, we saw a decline in fuel and capital goods. And the decline in fuel, they mean that the volume that the economy consumed went down. But it was a price effect. Because of the global reduction in oil prices, we benefited from that adjustment. So overall, extreme poverty declined during the year. However, so the bank was previously using the $2.15 and the 2017 purchasing power parity to measure poverty. But quite recently, we adopted a new metrics of $3 and using the using the 2021 purchasing power parity. Whichever metrics is used, we saw a decline in poverty levels as a result of stable growth and easing inflation. However, poverty levels remain high. 1 in every 3 Liberians was still poor in 2024. In terms of outlook for the next 3 years, that's 2025 included, 2025, 26, up to 27, we're projecting that the growth level will remain around 5%. Inflation is expected to ease, reaching around 6.8% in 2027, as long as the monetary authority continue to tighten to keep inflation low and stable. The current account deficit will remain around 13%. Yeah, high, but that will be driven by a number of factors. The economy will need to import, as inputs into its activity. So that is why we keep our extended position at that level. We expect that fiscal consolidation efforts that began in 2024 will continue, and so the fiscal deficit will remain low, hovering around 2% for this period. And with this, we expect that the debt level will remain stable at around 55%. But this outlook is subject to a number of rates, and the rates are tilted on the downside. The current economic model that Liberia has is more resource dependent, commodity dependent, and as such, external price shocks could undermine all of these frameworks that we have in place. So they are susceptible to price shocks, but also climate shocks. Like, we import a lot of our food, so if regions that are producing food are having some climate shocks, that could affect us. And weak governance. We have all this framework in place, but if we don't address the governance challenges, it could undermine this framework. And if there are fiscal slippages, that means the government going back on its fiscal policy or the monetary authority going back on its policy, could also undermine this framework. And there's a potential for continuing decline in extended aid, and if that compensated for on the domestic revenue mobilization, and that could also undermine the framework. So how can we translate this macroeconomic improvement and the positive outlook that we do have into quality jobs for Liberia? That's the question. That's the elephant in the room. And that's the problem that we have to solve on our last mile to 2030. When Liberia set out in 2012, the goal was to be a middle-income country by 2030. And we're staring at 2030. What can we do to be able to achieve some level of growth that will bring us close to that goal, if not better? And we can only do so by escaping the underdevelopment trap that we do have right now, and to be able to chart a new course for resilient growth. And that brings us to the topical issue that this edition of the Economic Update delved into. So to begin with, we want to talk about the structure of the economy. So this is the structure of the economy for the last 2 decades. Liberia, as you all know, came from war, and from 2024 to now, we've had peacetime. And this economy was heavily reliant on agriculture. There was just small industrial activity happening in 2004, and services was bearing the crust of the economy on the other end. And we've seen considerable structural transformation. The structure of the economy has changed in the last 2 decades. We saw a shift. Agriculture that was contributing 65% is now down to around 36%. The industrial sector has expanded its contribution from around 8 to around 24 now. And services now bears a bulk of the activity happening in the economy. But what does that say about this economy? Has this structural transformation come with massive job creation, or has it produced productive jobs for Liberians? That's the question. And if we look on the other end, what we've seen happen to employment is that we saw a transition of people from the agricultural sector or the primary sector straight to the tertiary or services sector. But what services are they? So these two sectors, agriculture and services, regardless of the fact that you see a considerable expansion in services, what is happening on the other end is that when you look at their output in terms of what they contribute to the economy versus the number of people in there who are employed, it points towards low productivity. So you have too many people in services, but they are contributing very less to the economy. And why is that? If you look at the services sector, it's predominantly driven by trade activity, some of transport activity, and so forth. And their contribution in terms of impact is very less. So this trend is not the trend we want to have. We want to have job creation happening, a job creation that use productivity to the extent that we'll be able to have inclusive and resilient growth over time. So just deepening on that, you look at the GDP or the output per person is employed, it's been flat over time. And why is that? There's one sector that has been, having a higher level of productivity, and that's the industrial sector. And if we deeper into the industrial sector, which is the red line on the left side, if you deep into the industrial sector, basically what is happening there is mining. And mining is capital intensive. You and I do know. You're able to take just a number of people, and they have very little positive spillover to the rest of the economy. So as a result, the lower productivity in agriculture and services is weighing heavily on overall productivity within the economy. So it remains flat. And this has limited the country's overall income growth. So if you look on this side, you see that Liberia, which is the red dot you see on the right-hand side, is lagging the structural peers. Low-income country, regional, and other countries that share similar structure, as well as its aspirational peers, they are far behind their aspirational peers. So how do we push the limit? How do we break these barriers to be able to move forward? We can only do as much if we begin to have productive jobs, that yield higher level of productivity for the economy. And one of the issues that comes out clearly, if you look at the labor market dynamics, is the fact that the labor force is expanding. This is putting pressure on the authorities or on the country, on the private sector, to be able to provide much more jobs. So if you look, we on average over the last 10 years or so, we had 55,000 new entrants to the labor force. And that's driven massively by the working age, the growth in the working age population. In the next 10 years, we expect that about a quarter of the current population will be reaching working age. And that raises the urgency for providing more jobs. So who's going to employ this working age population that we do anticipate? Government will be smaller in size, and we expect that the private sector should be able to absorb this growing working age population or this growing labor force. However, when we look at the structure, the current structure of Liberia private sector, it points to low potential in absorbing this huge workforce that is being anticipated. And why is that? If you look at the current structure of the private sector, firms that are employing less than 5 people account for a lion's share of the private sector. And firms that are employing anywhere between 5 to 19 accounts for the second largest share. So firms that are employing 100 plus people are less than 1%. So can this structure of the private sector absorb this growing workforce that's coming? That's the question that needs to be answered, and the only way we can start to solve this is to see what are the issues, what's holding back the private sector from being viable enough to absorb the growing labor force. That's part of the question we intend to answer. And if you look here on the other side, over the last 20 years, we had a stagnant wage employment. And wage employment, points towards quality job. And this has stagnated around 20% over the last 20 years. So a bulk of those employed are in vulnerable employment. So, on the other hand, we need to have, emergence of productive firms to be able to absorb the labor force, current and future labor force. And when you look at the business creation rate or business establishment rate in Liberia, it's very low. It's very low. So Liberia can count 2 newly registered LLCs or limited liability company, per every 10,000 added population each year. That's very small. And when you look at comparators, looking in 2020, Liberia had 15 times fewer LLCs compared to its neighbor Sierra Leone and Guinea. And if we're looking at other explorational countries that we intend to see if we can emulate, that's about 25 times fewer. This is a picture that we have to change if we would need to absorb the workforce or growing workforce. Then we start to look at the spatial dimension to this. Montserrat is not Liberia. So we have 15 counties, and when you look at firm level employment that is happening, firm level employment is concentrated in areas that do have infrastructure and do have access to services. So in terms of spatial dimension, we'll see that rural-urban migration continue to happen, and where are they coming to be absorbed in the urban areas? We are basically going towards low productivity sector in services, mainly trade and transportation. When that labor could be used in other areas, like manufacturing or industries also, to be able to drive the country level of productivity. So the concentration is in Montserrat, and if you left Montserrat, a little bit in Nema, and you will see that those other areas that have access to services or infrastructure, they are not quite far from all of the other scarcely absorbing areas. So this is something that needs, so we need to deconcentrate services, and we need to make sure that we break the barrier of infrastructure to be able to absorb the labor force across the country. So how do we do that? The government has set out its own plan through the Arrest Agenda for Inclusive Development, and it's looking at economic transformation as the way forward. So within economic transformation, we can only transform the economy if we address some of the burning issues that are within the private sector and make sure that that is complemented with investment, public investment activity that is happening to unlock the potential of the economy. And that's the way forward to be able to improve the situation or address the job challenges. So the report suggests a coordinated strategy. So the country manager mentioned that earlier, but I'll just go over them. And one of those issues that we think has to be addressed head on are the business environment issue. Why are we having a low business registration or business establishment rate? Because of a difficult business environment. So we ought to make sure that we enhance coordination. Some of the issues that are coordination failure, and that coordination has to happen between the public sector and the private sector. Much more of conversation needs to happen, and this needs to be taken at a high level. So high level coordination, probably led by, top level in government to make sure that they understand what the issues are for businesses and to take actions to be able to address them. Also, our legal system, some of the laws are not favorable. We need to look at them, modernize them if need be, to be able to address some of the issues with the private sector. And public-private partnership, like the minister mentioned, is really needed to be able to sort out what's happening. How can we collaborate with the private sector to unlock the potential of the economy in ways that we're able to create more productive jobs, and in so doing, enhance productivity and become more resilient. So the second approach is to be able to enable the emergence and expansion of productive firms. So those firms who saw, like if you look at the smaller firms that are employing 5 to 19 people, what can we do to address some of the constraints that people who are in that category are facing to unlock their potential to be able to be stronger and productive enough to create, better space for absorbing the labor force. So we need to do that. And we can do this through regulatory reforms. We can do that through financial and technical support, technological support. All of these are needed. It has to be a package to be able to break the barrier for firms in that category to become much more productive. A third approach could be to expand the labor market participation. And this can happen through skill development, active labor programs, and entrepreneurship support. Why aren't we creating more Liberian entrepreneurs? That's the question we need to answer. They say a problem with our school curriculum, they say a problem with our skills development program. Do we have a labor support program that is helping people to get at the level where they become much more productive? These are all questions that we think needs to be answered or needs to be addressed to be able to enhance labor market participation, particularly for youth, but also for women. And lastly, we need to stimulate the labor demand through investments. And when we were talking about investment, what we based on previous studies and so forth, one of the areas that have potential is agro-processing, and another area is light manufacturing activity. So we stimulate the demand, the labor demand, by making sure that, in this area where we do think we have comparative advantage, much more of efforts is being exerted in this area to stimulate labor demand, be able to absorb the anticipated labor force and even the current one. So, the key takeaways. In the last 2 decades, we've achieved structural transformation, like many economies have done. But these are yielded mixed results. We've had uneven growth. In the first decade, we saw sustained growth, averaging around 7%, per year. But then in the last decade, from 2014 to 2023, we grew at just 1.4% per year. So that's coming from a sustained path and then a collapse. And this has been the story of Liberia, going through cycles of recovery, collapse, contraction, back to recovery. How can we change this paradigm by being resilient to be able to absorb those shocks that are putting us through these cycles? That's something that needs to happen. And if this happens, this can only happen if we address the job issues. Because the jobs will create, the quality of job will make sure that we got a resilient workforce that will be able to enhance productivity over time. And when we look on the other side, look at all of the global indices, whether it's Global Competitive Index, or it's HBI, so most of those indices points towards a challenging business environment. So we need to turn the corner when it comes to addressing the issues, on business environment. This private sector that we do have, high-level vulnerable employment. How can we shift the dynamics to make sure that we correct some of we do course correcting in some areas in the private sector, while at the same time we provide support in ways that private sector will be able to thrive. So that's one way we think we can be able to enhance our business creation rate and so forth to be able to absorb this growing labor force. The labor force is expanding. This is something that raises urgency. You can do all you can and open up roads and so forth. You need to be able to absorb the labor force. And the only better way to do that is not through government, but through the private sector. And this should raise the urgency. So with notable progress in 2024 and the positive outlook for the next 3 years, how can we leverage this good time to be able to solve our job challenges? That's the question that policymakers, the development partners, the civil society, this is the question that has to be on our mind, and these are the issues that we need to think about to address. The AID is on that track, and it behooves a multi-stakeholder and coordinated approach to be able to achieve those objectives. So it calls for renewed commitment, calls for coordinated approach to the reforms, and to be able to unlock the job potential of Liberia. So thank you very much. I'll stop here. And